moderate this afternoon session where we're going to have basically, you could say, a session about forestries and about forestries and land use in developing countries. I'm going to try to do a bit more timekeeping so we don't eat away all the discussion time again at the end of the session. So I think we have like 20 minutes for each presentations for seeing and another 10 minutes for discussion. We can stretch it a little bit, but it will be more rigorous, and I don't mean that in a quasi-experimental meaning of the word. So with that, Stefano Pagiola has been working on pest issues. He's going to present something about his civil pastoral project in Colombia, and he's going to do that. Stefano.
Thank you, Sven. Of course, as soon as you say that there's some elastic interpretation, the incentives go away.
Question time.
Okay, I'm going to stand because I like standing when I'm talking. This is the latest set of results from a very long-term study that we've been doing in part of an area in Colombia called Quindío on the impacts of a PES program, which actually began back in 2003, so a decade ago now. We've been working in this area continuously since then. It's not strictly about forest conservation. There are some forest remnants here, but the primary effort of this program was restoration. But there's a lot of areas where if we want to have better forests, we'll have to restore forests. Simply conserving what's left may be necessary, but it's certainly not going to be sufficient to have the kinds of benefits we're looking for. So here this project has been working on the livestock sector. This is the kind of area we were looking at when we started. Very extensive production system. This used to be all coffee, but a couple of decades ago, with the coffee becoming much less profitable, it all became a livestock area. Very extensive production with generally very low productivity, half a head of cattle per hectare thereabouts. Lots of soil degradation, water contamination, very little biodiversity left, fairly high carbon emissions. Now there's lots of alternatives that would be much more productive, that would be better for water systems. You see how water quality compared in a watershed before and after silver pastoral measures were introduced. That would have much better biodiversity impacts. Here we see impacts on birds, number of bird species. And that would sequester more carbon, not as much as secondary forest, but substantially more than current land uses. But the main point is that a lot of these practices right now are not adopted. This is the landscape as we found it back in 2003, and if you're looking for the silver pastoral practices, they're right there. So not very widespread adoption at all. And why not? Basically because everything we knew told us these were profitable practices. But in fact, when you look at it from the perspective of having to adopt them, you have very high initial costs. And then it takes time for these practices to become established. And so even if they are in fact profitable, compared to current practices, these high upfront costs and the time it takes to become profitable mean that the profitability ex ante is fairly low. Here it seems positive, but 11-12% rate of return is just not terribly attractive. The hypothesis then is that we can tip the balance with a short-term payment, making it more profitable to adopt these practices. And we want to do it primarily for the environmental services that can be generated, but it also means higher performance. Now this is different from a standard sort of rural development type of project, which would typically have proposed a cost share subsidy will provide you 50% of the cost of adopting a new practice. That would be a typical type of scheme. It's different in two ways. One, that the payments we gave were not proportional to cost, they were proportional to expected benefits in terms of environmental services. And two, that these were ex post payments, and they were conditional performance. They were not ex ante subsidies, as was typically the case. Okay, and the way this would work is that with the additional initial payment, the financing becomes easier, the profitability, because they become profitable faster, and you can see the net result here is that profitability increases substantially. So that's the hypothesis we're working on. The specific project was financed by GEF, became effective in 2002. We started working in 2003 and it closed in 2008. So I'm going to present two sets of results here. One is simply how effective was the program while it was operating. These are results that were presented earlier in other venues as well. The newer results are what happened after that. A huge concern with this kind of project, any kind of short-term project, where you come in with an intervention of a limited duration and then leave, is what happens once you've left. It's easy to have an impact when you're there, both monitoring people and giving them subsidies or hitting them on the head of a stick, or whatever your approach may be. During that time, it's fairly easy to have results. But what happens when you leave? So this long-term impact is what we're focusing on understanding now. The project was implemented at 3 sites, but I'm going to only talk about the results at one of the sites in Colombia. You see that there, it's along that Cordillera, the Central Cordillera in Colombia. Okay, we had 4 treatments within the general treatment group got payments, but some of them got payments only for 2 years, and some of them got it for 4 years. And some of them got technical assistance, and others did not. Within the treatment group, we randomized. But the treatment group itself was not selected randomly. And this was basically for purely accidental reasons. And this was, remember, this is 2002 when we were preparing this. Ferraro and Fatanaik hadn't been published their paper yet, Money for Nothing. That came out in 2005. We were just beginning to talk about these things. So we decided to have a control group at the point where we had already selected a participant group. So we couldn't go back and randomize. But we had a whole lot of leftover applications from the application process. And we had not prioritized them anyway. We had simply taken applications, first come, first served, until we had 80, which is what the budget allowed us to take. And then we just shut down. But we had lots of leftover applications. So we had a lot of applications that had self-selected to join, just as those that we had accepted in the treatment group. And we had not ourselves picked the ones that we had accepted on any basis, such as farm size or anything other than at what point that piece of paper landed on our desks. And the main problem we have with the control group is that it's fairly small. We had 80 households initially in the treatment group, and we could only afford to do 30 households in the control group. So it's a fairly small group, but I don't think we have any bias in selection. So we think it's a good control for the treatment. So 4 treatments, but then within the treatment group, we did randomize whether they were in a 2-year program or 4-year program, and whether they received technical assistance or not. The way the payments worked is we had an index. Every land use that we found in the landscape was given a certain number of points in terms of its expected biodiversity benefits, with 1 being the highest level and 0 being the lowest. And everything else is interpolated depending on relative to those maximum and minimum, which is fairly easy to do with carbon, basically based on biomass, relative biomass. For biodiversity, it's less clear, but we try to use based on structure, diversity of number of species and a number of other things to do this ranking. So it's a mixture of things where we had actual studies that said this particular land use had such and such a level of carbon relative to forests, and others where we interpolated. And the way it works is we calculated the initial points for every land use on the farm, and we gave an initial payment for that. But then the bulk of payments were incremental payments. So if they switched, for example, in this example, from natural pasture without trees, which has 0.2 points, to natural pasture without tree density, which has 1 point, that's 0.8 incremental points multiplied by $75. They would get $60 per hectare per year. After we've verified that they had adopted, they had in fact made a change. If they made a change to a larger, to another land use, whatever the points difference would be, multiplied by. They had they could pick any land use they wanted and adopt it at any point within the program period. Here's the treatment groups. We see the number of households in each. This is the number of households we had left at the end. So we lost some along the way, mostly people who died or left the area, sold their land and left the area entirely. Nobody dropped out of the program per se, other than by dying. Okay. So this I've already explained. Use some statistics on participants, different groups. There are some statistically significant differences across these. You'd expect that in a fairly small sample such as this. So we'll have to allow for that when we do our analysis. Okay, so in terms of the impact of the program itself, we were interested in primarily, does this work? Does this give us land use change? And then we had lots of secondary questions such as, are the poor in particular able to participate? And the short answer to that first question is yes. You see land use changes of the treatment group as a whole compared to the control group. The lowest environmental service index land use at the bottom, the most desirable one at the top. And you can see big reductions in undesirable land uses, pasture, no trees, or degraded pasture by the control group, and large increases in much more desirable land uses. The control group also made some changes, but they're much less both in magnitude and in quality. So very substantial changes. The control group, the PES households changed almost half their entire farm area to new land uses. Anyone who's worked on land use change knows that almost half your farm in 4 years is a lot of land use change. So here you see the results at the landscape scale. These are treatment households before the project and after the project. Large reduction in these particularly undesirable land uses, big expansion in these silvipastoral land uses at the top there. Okay, now obviously there's lots of other things going on that we need to take into account, farm size and so forth. So we ran a number of models to look at that. It's not a simple adoption issue because we had so many possible adoption options. It's not a yes or no you're participating, it's how much you're changing. And that could be measured a number of ways. Area change is the obvious one, but some farms being small have many less hectares, so they can change much less. So we also look at the proportion of the farm change. But then to capture the quality of the change, we also look at how much the ESI points, Environmental Service Index points, increase. And again, you can express that in absolutes. 3% changes and an intensity of environmental services per hectare. All of these possible dependent variables have their own justification. What you see is that obviously some things in terms of actual per area change, obviously farm size matters. You see other things like herd size matters in a number of these, sometimes labor matters, accessibility in some cases, topography. But the one thing that does come out very clearly is that being a PES recipient, it has a very positive impact and a significant impact in every formulation. Within that, the sub-treatments don't seem to make much difference. The 2-year option has sometimes a positive, sometimes a negative, but none of these differences are significant, which is actually good news, because if you can do this kind of change in a shorter program, that's great. So next time around, we can do it somewhat easier. Technical assistance doesn't seem to be significant. It's only significant in one case, and that's less clear why that is. All the farmers were very clear in saying that they found the technical assistance very valuable. So one thing that may be happening here is that it's nobody's going to share the payment they receive. On the other hand, sharing the technical assistance they receive, the lessons they receive with their neighbors, it doesn't cost anyone anything, except maybe some time. So it's much easier for the technical assistance to diffuse, whereas the payments will only be received by those who receive them. So that's one possible explanation. If that's what's going on, then the control groups are also essentially part of the treatment group, at least with respect to technical assistance, and so the difference would tend to go away. So that's one possible explanation. So I think one does have to be careful about just looking at the sign and saying, and the significance level, and say, okay, well, we'll stop doing this, or we'll always do this. You have to, again, look at the story, as Alex was saying, what's going on here. Here's the impact on environmental services. Again, big increase, 50% increase for the PES recipients, much smaller increase for the control. Actually, that's not a significant difference here within the control group, whereas this change here is very significant. And in terms of some of the other questions we had, are the poor able to participate here also? It's quite positive. The poor, obviously, the poor tend to have smaller farms, so they changed less in terms of hectares. And they generated less additional services in terms of absolute amounts. But in terms of relative amounts, they changed either statistically the same amount or sometimes more, but none of these differences are statistically significant across the groups. And there's actually a very large variation in income levels within our sample, from extremely poor households to extremely rich households. This is a very heterogeneous population in terms of income levels. You can also see the fact that the poor here, again, taking into account other things, you'll see that not significant in those cases. Okay, let's now quickly look at the long-term impacts. Because again, we worry about what happens afterwards. After 2008, in fact after 2007, there was really no additional payments, no additional technical assistance. We just packed up and went home. So strong concern was how permanent were these changes. And again, we had other questions that we're trying to look at. For example, to the extent that the adoption was not so much because of the financial incentives, but because of learning, did this learning then spread to others? So to find out some of these answers, try to answer some of these questions, we resurveyed all the participants in 2011, so that's 4 years after the last payment. We still had 75 households and 29 controls. We updated all the land use maps for all of them and recalculated everything. So here's the results for the period after the project. So the good news is we did not lose most of the gains we had. For the treatment households, you see very minor changes after in the 4 years subsequent to the end of the project. In fact, much bigger changes in the control group households. Although this is a bit of a statistical fluke, these changes here are all driven by 5 households making big changes. And we need to look at what's the story with these particular 5 households. There's actually an extra household doing a very similar change in the PES group, but it's a bigger group, and so you don't see it. You don't see it as much in the aggregate numbers. There's probably something going on with that particular set of households that made some permanent crops suddenly become interesting in this first project view. But basically, the good news is we did not see any substantial abandonment of the land use changes that have been adopted during the project. The bad news is we didn't see any substantial extension of these land uses. So if you're asking did the PES work, it worked in the sense that it succeeded in having large land use changes. And it worked, looking at these numbers, it seems to work primarily because of the financial incentives, rather than because of any learning effects. If it was primarily learning effects, you'd think that the people would go on adopting practices now that they knew how to do them. But evidently, without payments, it seems that they don't. It may be, however, that people have already adopted as much as they can on their individual farms. And now there's nothing else that they can profitably adopt, given heterogeneity within the farm. So that's another possible hypothesis. So we can certainly conclude that DES worked during the period of treatment, and that it did not result in land use choices that were unsustainable, because there was no abandonment. But then we still need to look more carefully at some of the other strategies. Okay, moving on. So again, at the landscape scale, you see relatively little changes in 2011 compared to 2007. But the changes compared to the beginning period were maintained. In terms of environmental services, this is the results for the project that I showed earlier. And in 2011, relatively little change. Again, compared to that, there's a slight reduction. This is slightly lower than this, but not statistically significant difference. So PES works, but again, one does have to look at it a bit more carefully, and I'm trying to get to the end. You can see that the adoption was all in these kinds of, oh, come on. Was all in these mid-level land uses. These land uses at the top here had the highest offered payments because they had the highest points. So adopting these land uses would have resulted in the highest payments, and yet nobody adopted them, practically. And whereas these intermediate land uses, which had points in the 1.4, 1.6 sort of range, were adopted quite heavily. The explanation, I think, is that these are all productive practices. These are pasture areas, these are intensive silvopastoral systems. These are all practices that once adopted are profitable. Whereas these top-level practices here are practices that once adopted generate very little, if no income for the landlord. They may generate a lot of environmental services, which is why they have high point levels, but they're not attractive to land users. So not surprising that if we only offer them a short-term payment, they're not going to adopt them. They'll adopt those which, even once the payment ends, are profitable. Which is also why they don't abandon them. They picked the ones that they knew they were going to keep. And I think this is one strength of this particular project, is that we gave them a whole range of choices. So we don't care what you adopt. The more desirable the things that you adopt from our point of view, the more we pay you, but we don't care what you adopt. And so they picked things that made sense for them. Whereas projects that focus on one thing are much more likely to be unsustainable, because the chances that you've picked the one thing that is in fact their best bet is fairly low. And that leads us to the diagram that Alex already showed us this year, is that we can divide the practices that we might want people to adopt from an environmental service perspective into 3 broad groups. in terms of their profitability compared to current practices. One group would be very profitable to farmers, so profitable that once you've shown them how to do it, once they're aware of their characteristics, they'll adopt them even without any assistance from us. One group that is profitable once established, but that has whose high costs make it unattractive from the standpoint of landholders considering the adoption, and one which is not profitable even once adopted. So here we have our pure forest conservation. Whereas here we have a lot of silvipastoral practices. On the evidence of our long-term results, we don't really have any practices that have these characteristics in our particular area, under these particular conditions that we face today. That may not be universally true, and at least conceptually, these practices exist, but we didn't see them in our land use system. And that leads to different approaches to addressing each of these. If these exist, we might need to give them some credit or technical assistance to facilitate their adoption, but they're so profitable that they can be reimbursed in credit. Whereas these practices, if you try to finance them with credit, you make their attractiveness in this period much less. And so a short-term PES would be much more effective, but a short-term PES is sufficient. These practices in Group C would only work with a sustained long-term, essentially indefinite stream of payments to complement the actual incomes. Okay, just to finish, we do face a lot of challenges in undertaking impact evaluations of these kinds of conservation interventions. One is in actually measuring the impact of what we'd like to see is more environmental services, but the signal for that is often incredibly noisy. The results I showed for environmental service generation in Quindío are all based on simply applying our index to the land uses. The actual level of services will probably vary substantially. Here's an example of turbidity from a watershed in the Espírito Santo in Brazil, and you can see how even without any interventions, the levels of turbidity, the average and the maximum turbidity, vary substantially from year to year. There is a trend here, but the actual signal around that. So simply observing levels of environmental service in a given year is a very poor guide to how effective you are. And for a whole set of strategies whose ultimate objective is to generate environmental services, this is a big problem. So we have to use proxy or things like that. Some standard impact evaluation techniques are probably unlikely to work. Regression discontinuity probably doesn't work in a lot of cases, because if you're working on a watershed scale, as you are in many cases, the discontinuity isn't just an arbitrary line. It's a very meaningful line, and being on one side or the other is of that line is something that does affect your behavior. The pipeline approach probably doesn't work either, because it's very easy to delay things like planting a tree or cutting a tree. So if you know that you're going to get the reforestation program next year, and you're intending to plant, well, okay, I'll just wait a year until you pay me to do so. So it looks like the program is actually very effective when all you've done is move around. So this can be very, very misleading in this sense. Plus, ultimately, all these programs have a very low number of observations, which complicates statistical analysis in general, and it also means that often randomization will not be feasible. You simply don't have enough observations within which to randomize. So you have to look at other things. Okay, sorry for going over, but again, the way you phrase the restriction, you